Good morning, Ms. Seedat.
Morning.
Let me explain the arrangements to you. You're talking to a small group of people here in Aldwych House. Those in front of you are participants, core participants, and others. To your left, there are lawyers representing various interests. And at the back of the room, there may be, from time to time, representatives of the press. Miss Fraser Butlin will be asking you the questions. She's on her feet at the moment. In a minute, Eamon will invite you to swear your affirmation. Eamon.
Please state your full name.
Zubeda Seedat.
And please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
I omitted to mention that beyond this room, you'll be talking to around about 100 people who will be watching on live stream or YouTube. Ms. Fraser Butler.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Seedat, I want to just start with a brief overview of your career. You joined the civil service as an administrative assistant in 1988.
I did, yes.
And then over the years you've been promoted and you're
yes.
currently a senior executive officer.
I am.
In terms of what we're going to be discussing today, the role that you were in was as a higher executive officer.
I was.
At the Blood Policy Unit between 2002 and 2008.
That's correct.
Just in terms of some general questions about the team, when you joined, you had 2 administrative support team members below you.
I did, yes.
And then what was the structure above you?
So above me, I had an SEO and a grade 6. And then above that, we would have a grade 5 and then a director.
Okay, so Jill Taylor was the senior executive officer.
Yes.
And then there was the grade 6, initially Charles Lister, then Richard Gotowski.
That's right.
And then William Conan.
That's correct.
At some point, Jill Taylor left the team, didn't she?
She did, yes.
And was she replaced?
She wasn't, no.
So that would leave you, and just in terms of hierarchy, there was then the gap above you.
That's correct.
And a gap above that, the grade 7.
That's correct.
And then the grade 6.
That's right.
Who was in post.
Sure, yeah.
Was that structure unusual, or was it fairly frequent in teams to have such a huge gap between you as an HEO and the grade 6?
It is slightly unusual. In most of the teams I've worked in, you would have a HEO, SEO, and you would almost definitely have a grade 7 between them and then a grade 6. So very unusual in terms of the teams I've worked in.
And as an HEO, can you tell us a little bit about what your role primarily involved?
Sure. So within the blood team, it was quite a varied role in the sense that I did a lot of reactive work. So that would be all the briefing work. So that would be parliamentary work, so written questions, private office cases, treat official cases which came into ministers. I worked on various committees. So we had a committee called MSBTO. We had I worked on supporting the recombinant rollout. We had a group, the National Commissioning Group on blood prices. So there's various committee work involved. But in terms of the reactive work, it wasn't only around the contaminated blood issue. There were also very current live issues within the blood service around blood supply and kind of criteria around blood donations and that kind of thing. So it was working on kind of like past events as well as kind of live events within the blood service as well.
And in terms of what you were doing with all of those things, was your role a policy role or was it essentially administrative?
I'd say it was policy. Mm-hmm.
Were you making policy decisions?
I wasn't, no. I was definitely supporting policy decision, but not a decision maker myself.
During your time with the blood policy team, you had 3 different leads that we've discussed. Can you tell us anything about their styles of management and whether there was a different management style between Charles Lister, Richard Gutowski, William Conan?
There are, I mean, everyone brings a different character and personality to a role. So Charles, obviously, was my first role. Charles was my first grade 6 while in the roles. I learnt an awful lot from Charles. He was really hardworking. He was very approachable. He'd come out kind of towards the end of the day and have a chat with me. So I guess that was kind of, he was quite relaxed, Charles. Richard, I think, was a bit more formal, a bit more old school, but again, very approachable, got on with the job in hand. William was probably by far the most relaxed from all my team leaders that I worked with. I think when William was there, we probably had few more staff, so there was more scope for delegation as well when William was in the team.
The inquiries heard evidence from Charles Lister and Richard Gutowski, and they both said that the team was incredibly busy throughout their time.
Yeah.
Was that also your experience?
Absolutely. I think in all my time in the civil service, it was probably by far the most busiest team I've been in. We were incredibly stretched in terms of resourcing. You mentioned at the beginning that when I joined the team, there were 2 administrative staff below my grade. But while in the team, those posts had disappeared. So essentially, for the most part, I was kind of like the junior member of the team. So I did have an enormous workload. It was a very, very busy team, and without anyone, so to speak, below me or above me till we get to the grade 6 grade, it was just, I think a lot fell on me during that time. I should say I did have a bit of admin support at some point, but it wasn't on a permanent basis.
And what was your understanding of why the workload was so high in this team?
I mean, it was just a heavy postback that we got. There was huge amounts of parliamentary interest in the whole area around contaminated blood. So I was constantly having to deal with the reactive work, so we'd get lots of parliamentary questions, written and oral questions. I already mentioned the huge postbag of correspondence that we received. There was just so much going on in the team. While I was in the team, we had the Freedom of Information Act was introduced, and so again that resulted in ever-increasing workloads without the additional resource to support any of that. So there was just lots and lots of reactive work constantly.
I want to come back to some of the parliamentary questions and correspondence a little bit later this morning, but before we do that, I want to just look with you at some of the policies in place dealing with documents and records retention. Could we turn to WITN 3996002, please? What I'm going to do, Ms Seedat, is take you through quite a lot of it and then ask you about it at the end. So we can see a sticky note on the front to say that it's been updated up to 1996. But if we turn the page, we can see at the bottom that it was originally produced in July 1994, and it's a guide for records managers and reviewing officers. If we then turn on to page 11, it sets out at the top the types of file, the 3 main types of registered or official files. Policy files, these usually have pink covers and are the most frequently used type of file. They contain either records on a particular subject or administrative or financial records. Policy files are opened as necessary by local registries. Particular instance papers, a series of files dealing with the same subject but different cases. And then private office files, which would be yellow or orange, dealing with MP inquiries, or green with parliamentary questions, and they're opened and dealt with in private office or specialist sections. Which type of files would you be dealing with?
Policy files.
So the pink files. Then if we turn to page 30, we see the heading closing files. And we've got a note, procedures for the closure and storage of files are very precise and it's important they're adhered to. Closing files, local registries should close files when they reach 3 centimetres thick. At this point, a new volume should be opened. They're 5 years old. That's 5 if 5 years have elapsed since the begins date on the cover of the file, or nothing new has been added for 2 years. And if we turn the page, we have storing files. If files are in constant use, they should either be in the branch or stored in the relevant registry. Even once a file has been reviewed, if it's still in use, it should be retained in the branch until there's no longer a need to hold it locally. However, a reviewed file may only be kept locally up to the date of its second review. When this date is passed, the file must be sent to the DRO for review. The file can then be returned back to the branch if it's still needed. If space is short in a branch, files can be stored at the DRO. Files to be stored at DRO must be reviewed first, and this can be done within 6 months of the file ends date. The DRO will store a file until the date for destruction at first review is reached, or the date of the second review is reached, whichever is appropriate. And then if we turn to page 33, we have set out here the process for reviewing files, and we see that officially files are recommended for review 2 years after the date of the last action. In practice, some branches do not have sufficient storage space to hold files for this long. And then if we go down to the next section, reviewing policy files in the branch, all policy files are reviewed in the branch. The branch reviewing officer must be grade EO, executive officer, or above. The officer is appointed by branch line management and must have a thorough knowledge of the administrative needs of the branch. And then there is the note that the registry officer will refer the files due for review to decide whether it should be destroyed at first review. Over the page, we see it in red. Thank you. Retained by the DRO for a second review. And then if we just carry on with the document, Ms. Seedat, page 37. We see a heading, private office files. Private office files are not reviewed at all. Once the final reply has been sent to the MP, the files may be sent to the DRO for storage. They're kept there for 3 years before being destroyed. Some branches file private office files in local registries, treating them as policy files, or copy the contents to other files, and there's a request that they should be sent to the DRO. This document's obviously from 1994. Was this the system of dealing with documents and the retention of records that you were familiar with using?
It was, yes.
And was it broadly the same from 1988 when you joined until this document?
I think so, yes. I can't really remember any deviation in terms of the policy.
And in the blood policy team when you were there, obviously much later on than 1988, who was the branch reviewing officer?
I think it would be me. There wasn't anyone else to do it.
If we can turn then to WITN 6955036, please. We have a memo from the Permanent Secretary to all DH staff in 1994. I'm not sure whether this would have come across your desk at all, Ms. Seedat.
I mean, it's addressed to all DH staff, so I expect it would have done.
Okay. And it indicates there have been considerable changes in departmental organisation and staffing over the past few years, which have led to weaknesses in departmental record keeping. Further, the introduction of OIS has changed the way in which business is done. Do you happen to know what OIS is?
I think it was the move to the electronic system.
Then sets out the department continues to need traceable records for 3 reasons: to ensure we can account for actions taken, to enable us to take action that's consistent with our past statements and actions, and to avoid inefficient searching for material. And then it goes on to indicate that there will be a rolling programme of training and a leaflet would be provided to each staff member. Do you recall anything about this initiative dealing with document management?
I don't recall the training. I don't, I'm afraid, no.
And then if we go to WITN 6955037, this is the leaflet that's referred to. Again, do you recall receiving anything like this?
I expect I would have done, but I couldn't recall it.
And just while we're looking at it, so that those listening can also be aware of what's here, it's a leaflet that folds up, so we actually need to start on page 2. And we can see the note of why keep records. Good record keeping is an essential part of the work of any government department and is largely the result of efficient filing. And then there's a setting out of the 3 bullet points about why it's important to keep a record of the work done. Those coming after you can find out what's been done or not done on a particular case or issue. Any decisions made can be justified or reconsidered at a later date, and you can work with maximum efficiency. And if we go back a page, which would have been the other side of the leaflet, we pick up the heading Storing and Closing Files. Any file no longer needed should be sent to your registry for filing. Files should only be kept at your workstation if you're using them. And then, I'm sorry, we have to go to the next page, which is the flip side, to carry on reading. Files should be closed if they're over 3 centimetres thick, if they're over 5 years old, or if nothing new has been added for 2 years. And it advises how to close a file. So much the same advice on how to deal with documents. Is that right?
Yes.
I want to then pick up in June 2003. You were tasked with answering a parliamentary question about Lord Owen's papers being missing, and Charles Lister responded with a memo.
He did, yes.
DHSC 00200720_081, please, Lawrence. Thank you. We can see here that it's an email from Charles Lister to you, and we can see it sets out the remit of the Bergen report on self-sufficiency, and then we pick up the paragraph starting unfortunately. Unfortunately, none of the key submissions to ministers about self-sufficiency from the 70s, early 80s appear to have survived. Our search of relevant surviving files from the time failed to find any. One explanation for this is that papers marked for public interest immunity during the discovery process on the HIV litigation have since been destroyed in a clear-out by Sol. There is an email from Anita James to me confirming this. This would have happened at some time in the mid-90s. I suspect that Lord Owen's allegation about pulped papers refers to the papers kept by private office, which are never kept after a change of government. They're either shredded or handed back to the relevant policy section. However, the fact that we can no longer find any of these documents, so can't say what ministers did or didn't know about the state of play on self-sufficiency, just plays into the hands of the conspiracy theorists. The email then deals with what has to be done before the self-sufficiency report can be published. And from your statement, Ms. Seedat, this is when you think you first became aware that papers on blood and blood products had previously been identified as having been destroyed.
I think so, yes.
Your involvement became more significant in 2004, 2005, and the issue of missing documents came up in relation to 3 things I want to explore with you. Lord Jenkins' papers, some various parliamentary questions and correspondence, and the work that was done on the Bergen report. But before we deal with those specifics, could you explain to us how things practically worked when you were dealing with parliamentary questions and correspondence? Where did you get your information from to know how to answer those questions or correspondence?
So on this occasion, it was an issue I didn't know anything about. I think Charles had just left the team, and I may have emailed him in his new post to find out what this was, what the issue was around, and Charles then responded. As I mentioned before, we had lots and lots of correspondence, PQs on the subject areas. So I was very heavily reliant on previous parliamentary questions, statements in Parliament, and information I generally managed to find from the file.
So, just so that we're all clear, in the file in the department you would have previous answers to parliamentary questions.
That's right, they would have been filed.
And you'd have previous answers to correspondence.
That's correct, yes.
And I think what you just said to us was you'd use those to answer new questions.
I did. I mean, obviously, when I first joined the team, Jill Taylor was still in the team, so we did have some level of corporate knowledge within the team. So if I were to be answering some correspondence or PQ, Jill would check those facts for me. And kind of that's eventually how I guess built up my knowledge of the lines to take being used within the team.
And just so we're clear in terms of your role, I don't think you weren't preparing the lines to take as such in terms of, unless it was something new that needed to be addressed.
That's correct. I didn't develop any of the lines for the most part that I was within the team. That's correct.
Can we then pick up in relation to Lord Jenkin? If we turn to WITN 4912003, we have an email from the Scottish executive which has been forwarded to you, and it's the beginning of the matters. It attaches a letter from, we will say, Mr. X. You'll see that he requests copies of papers and mentions a secret report funded by Westminster. I'd be grateful for any comments you can offer on this and your advice on the result of the review of papers files within DH England to allow me to prepare a response. The inquiry's looked at the correspondence on this already with Richard Gutowski, but in turn it triggered a letter from Lord Jenkin. And if we can turn to that, WITN 4912005. We can see here, I enclose a letter I've had from Mr. X, who raises a number of subjects, including a so-called secret Westminster-funded report into haemophilia and hepatitis, non-A, non-B, between 1979 and 1982, for most of which time I was the Secretary of State for Health and Social Services. I also enclose a copy of my reply to Mr. X, which makes it clear that because I was the Minister at the time he's inquiring about, I feel under some duty to try and satisfy his curiosity. You'll also see that I have no present recollection of any secret report into the subject, but it may be that the files could disclose something along those lines. I'd be most grateful if you could consult officials and let me know whether there is at any point my taking this matter further. You then helped draft a reply to this letter.
I did.
Is that right? And the final version that was sent is at WITN 3996005. If we just pick up the second paragraph. I do understand your wish. The letter was sent by Lord Warner to Lord Jenkin. I do understand your wish to be helpful to Mr. X. As you rightly say, however, it's very difficult to go back some 25 years to recollect details, especially as many of the people involved are sadly no longer with us. My officials have carried out a search of the relevant files, but can find no trace of information relating to the secret Westminster-funded report that Mr. X mentions. However, I understand that Mr. X also wrote to staff at the Scottish Executive We've traced a report of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party for the year 1980-81. A copy of this report's already been sent to Mr X, but I'm enclosing a further copy for your records. I apologise for the poor quality of the copy. Can you explain what involvement you had in terms of searching the relevant files?
I can't recall at this point in time, but I think from previous correspondence I had been in touch with Sandra Falknet, the Scottish executive, and that's how I think I came to be aware of the document that we then sent to the correspondent.
If we then turn to WITN 49121011, please, and the second page of it. This is an email from Sean Gallagher, the head of the Chief Executive's office. And it says this: we discussed this case. As Francis knows, I had a phone call from Lord Jenkin in response to the letter he received from Lord Warner. He was concerned that the reply he'd received gave the impression that the department held no records on the subject in question and was looking to take up the issue of DH's filing and document management with the Permanent Secretary. Although I have looked at the original letter and the reply sent, I do not really understand what the situation is. For instance, whether the Scottish papers are likely to be the secret Westminster funded report that Mr X was talking about, whether our records have anything on the subject of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Hepatitis Working Party at all, and why the Scottish Executive have records that we don't. And the plan was then for a further letter to be sent to Lord Jenkin.
It was, yes.
And you prepared a draft reply and background note.
I did, yes.
Could we turn to that? DHSC 02000048. And if we pick up at page 3, please. This is the background note that I think you prepared. Is that right?
I did, yes.
And it sets out the background, and then in the third paragraph, unfortunately in this case the reply from Lord Warner to Lord Jenkin was drafted by the correspondence unit using a number of standard lines, and the reply did not fully address the points raised in the letter. It also left Lord Jenkin with the impression that we had inadequate file records. Lord Jenkin rang Sir Nigel's office to take up the issue of the department's filing and document management system. The draft letter seeks to reassure Lord Jenkin that DH does operate an effective records management system. We've also used this opportunity to give Lord Jenkin a fuller response to his letter. And just before we look at the draft letter, the reference there to the response having been prepared by the correspondence unit using a number of standard lines. Mm-hmm. Were you involved in providing those standard lines to the correspondence unit?
My recollection at the time is that correspondence team had, from not just our team, sort of across the department, it was quite a central system, they had just standard lines to take. So when correspondence came in, not necessarily just on blood, but any particular policy, in the first instance, if it was quite routine correspondence, they relied on those standard lines to take. If they were slightly more complicated or needed additional information, then they would come to the policy team.
Then if we turn the page, we see the draft reply. And it says this: I've been advised that you recently contacted Sir Nigel's office about my letter dated the 27th of January. I understand you expressed concern about the department's filing and record management systems. I would firstly like to correct the impression I may have given that we hold no records on the treatment of haemophilia patients, blood safety and related issues. The Department of Health has a departmental records office that holds closed files on these issues. These files have been subject to a branch review. Clearly, keeping good records is fundamental to the day-to-day running of the department. We recognise that much of the work we do has long-term consequences, and accurate records are essential if future users are to be able to see why certain decisions were made or why certain things did or did not happen. This is a message that's regularly communicated and reinforced to staff. There's then a discussion about Mr X's request and what the inquiry has come to understand to be the line to take in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. Then we pick up in the final paragraph of the letter over the page. With regards to the reference to minutes of the MBTS, officials have identified files on the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, which was established in 1980. The first meeting was held on the 1st of December 1980. It would be helpful if Mr X could confirm, firstly, if it's the papers for this advisory committee he'd like to see, and secondly, if he could be specific about the period and issues that he's interested in before officials make an assessment on the release of the documents. And Mr X is then invited to contact William Conan. When there is a reference to the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, was this a reference to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood?
I don't think so. They're very different, the names of the committee. So, I mean, obviously I can't recollect my thoughts at the time, but looking at the papers now, they are very different committee names. And
by this stage, I think you were aware that some files had been destroyed, the GEB files.
That's what date is this was? I expect
this
I
is
would
2005.
have done. I would have done, yes.
But there's no reference in the letter to papers having been destroyed.
No.
Do you recall why that wasn't made clear to Lord Jenkin at the outset?
I can't recall, I'm afraid.
Do you recall any discussion about that within the department with perhaps Mr Conan?
I don't know.
From your statement, your background note was unfortunately included in the reply to Lord Jenkin, and it wouldn't normally have been.
Sure. Can I just also make the point, although I would have drafted the letter, it would have been cleared by my grade 6 at the time, so I take ownership for the fact that I would have done the first draft, but it might have been tinkered with by William, and obviously I couldn't tell kind of the points that he may have added or which were my original ones. I just want to make that really clear.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms Seedat. That's very helpful, and it goes back to what we were discussing at the beginning, that your seniority in the department would it be everything you sent out would be cleared?
So because most of this was ministerial or senior officers, most of it, the majority of it, I'd say, would need grade 6 clearance or grade 5 clearance, definitely, yes.
There was then a meeting held between Lord Crisp and Lord Jenkin, and you prepared a briefing note for that meeting, which again went out in Mr Conan's name.
Indeed, yes.
And would therefore have been cleared by Mr Conan.
That's correct.
Could we look at that? WITN 4912039. If we pick it up on page 2, please. We can see that at the top it's from William Conan, and it's dated the 11th of April 2005. There is a set of paragraphs dealing with the background, and then a heading, previous request from Lord Jenkin. We understand from colleagues that on a previous occasion in 1999, Lord Jenkin wrote seeking access to policy papers, including unpublished research studies that he had brought with him when he arrived at the DHSS in 1979. On that occasion, colleagues were unable to locate the documents. In fact, it's unlikely they would have been retained, as they wouldn't have been required either to support administrative needs or accountability. Do you recall any discussion about why those very early papers hadn't been retained?
I can't recall, I'm afraid.
And when the memo talks about they wouldn't have been required to support administrative needs or accountability, what was that dealing with?
I mean, I don't know if these were perhaps his own papers or whether they were necessarily departmental papers. So it's a bit difficult to kind of give a view on that, I think.
Just stepping back from the specifics of Lord Jenkins' papers, that phrase that papers weren't required to support administrative needs or accountability, was that a touchstone for a decision on whether to retain documents?
I mean, in my view, in terms of file retention, I would always assess, I can only speak for myself, obviously, you know, I would always assess the administrative value of a file. And I think in the whole time I've been in the department and we had paper files, there were very few occasions I had any reason to mark papers for destruction within a particular date or anything like that. So I can only kind of speak from my personal experience, I think.
Of course, we then have the lines to take. Many key papers from the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed. During the HIV litigation in 1990, many papers from that period were recalled. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. And over the page, we've been in touch with the Departmental Records Office to check which files related to the treatment of haemophilia patients and blood safety are still in existence from the period between 1979 to 1981. We've obtained a list of some files from this period. However, at first glance, it's not clear about the extent to which these files will hold papers that Lord Jenkins will have handled. It would require significant staffing resource to go through these files to identify official papers that Lord Jenkins handled at the time. We've not sought to deny Lord Jenkins access to any official papers. The reply from PSL focused on addressing some very serious comments from Mr. X about blood safety and the transmission of hepatitis C. We are aware of the Civil Service guidance on access to official papers by former ministers produced by the Cabinet Office. If Lord Jenkins is able to be more specific about the subject matter or documentation that he'd like to see, then we can undertake a search for specific papers. At this stage, it seems from the lines to take that a list of the files had been obtained. Mm-hmm. Was any thought given at that point to whether the files on the list should be put in the public domain in some way, given what you've said, there were ongoing requests and correspondence and questions about this?
I can't recall, I'm afraid.
Do you recall ever having any discussion about that with Mr. Conan?
I don't know, I just don't recall.
You then also attended the meeting.
Are we leaving this document?
We are, sir, yes.
I wonder if I may just ask a question. Excuse me. Could we go back to the page before, please, on the screen? And the very first bullet point at the bottom of the page. Those words are yours, are they?
They would be based on information that I had gleaned from Charles Lister when he first informed me about the destruction of these documents.
Now, can you help with the link between something being not adequately archived, whatever that may mean, and destruction?
So, I mean, they were obviously not adequately archived in the sense that they were not on registered files.
So what this is really saying is that the papers weren't put in a file which was identifiable as a registered file.
That's correct, I think, yes.
And why would that lead to destruction?
Well, I don't know.
Because that's what this implies, doesn't it? Doesn't it suggest that there's a link between the failure to have a registered file and the fact of destruction?
I mean, I can only go by what I was told at the time, that the papers were after the litigation. They were not adequately archived, and they might have been in a cabinet somewhere and somebody may have taken a decision to destroy them. That's how I'd interpreted it.
So nobody is actually clear at this stage that they have been destroyed. Would that be right?
Well,
they can't be found, but they...
Well, I'd had information from Anita and from Charles that they had been destroyed.
Right. So you understood from them that someone, somewhere, had chosen to destroy these files, maybe for good reason, may not be.
That's correct, yes.
But you can't help with any more detail.
That's right. I mean, these were events that happened in the past. That I was only going by information that people had told me.
If you'd had more detail at the time, would that have been in your briefing note?
It would have depended on the information I was given. I don't know. I can't say because I wasn't given any additional information.
Because the briefing note's at a fairly high level. It doesn't descend to very much by way of detail.
I mean, as I said, I could only provide information that I was aware of at the time.
Yes, of course. So this is the limit of your information as given to you by Mr. Lister.
That's correct.
At the time. Yes, thank you.
You attended the meeting between Nigel Crisp and Lord Jenkin, I think. And it was quite an unusual meeting for you to attend because it was such a high level. Is that right?
Yeah.
You've said in your statement you have no real independent recollection of the meeting.
I don't. I remember it happened. I think, vaguely, I remember it was a fairly short meeting. I remember talking to Sean, Sir Nigel's private secretary, just before the meeting. But I don't remember the actual detail of the discussions.
I want to ask you about one point, and it may be that you can't assist us, but could we go to ARCH 302968, please? It's the statement of Lord Jenkin to the Archer inquiry, and it's paragraph 7 on page 2 that I want to pick up with you. Lord Jenkin explains that it wasn't until the 13th of April that he met Sir Nigel Crisp and put the whole matter to him. And then 5 lines down he says this, he, Sir Nigel Crisp, then went on to explain that there are indeed a large number of files held at the Public Record Office and that it would be necessary for his officials to extract all those files which might be relevant to my inquiry. However, and this was perhaps the most important point to emerge from this meeting, Sir Nigel made it clear to me that all the files that bore upon the issue of contaminated blood products had been destroyed. He went on to explain that there had been a long process of litigation by and on behalf of HIV sufferers, which had culminated in those who were identified as having contracted their disease via contaminated blood being offered substantial sums of compensation. He then said that when this litigation had been settled and the compensation paid, it was felt by the department that there was no longer any point in retaining the files about contaminated blood and that they were accordingly destroyed. Do you have any recollection of anything being said in those terms?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Do you have any recollection of anything that might have been said that might have given Lord Jenkin that impression?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
So we've obviously heard the evidence of Lord Crisp dealing with that.
Yes, and we've just a moment ago heard your own knowledge in advance of this meeting that you didn't know why or in what circumstances they had actually been destroyed. So you can't recollect that it being said that it was because someone had thought there's no point in keeping these, therefore we'll destroy them. That would have been a reason for destruction. But can you recall anything like that?
I'm afraid I don't know.
Yep.
Thereafter, Lord Jenkin came and looked at some of his papers. We can take that off the screen. Thank you, Lawrence. When he came in to look at the papers, I think you were there to assist him. Do you recall how those papers had been gathered for him?
I obviously went through to the DRO, so the file office, and I think I also went to the National Archives. So I went through to various routes to try and narrow the search between his period in office to try and obtain files that might be of relevance from his period in office.
And when Lord Jenkin came to look at the papers, You said that he was concerned about so many being destroyed. What did he say to you about what he thought was missing?
I can't recall.
Do you remember anything of your discussion with Lord Jenkin
really
at that time?
No.
Lord Jenkin sought a further meeting with Sir Nigel Crisp, as he then was. And if we could turn to WITN 3996019. This is a minute from you to Sir Nigel. Would it have been cleared by anyone before it went to Sir Nigel?
It would almost certainly have been cleared by William.
And we see here at the start of it, Lord Jenkin has asked to meet with you again to discuss the issue of record management in the Department of Health and why papers from the 1970s and 1980s on the issue of haemophilia patients infected with hepatitis C have been destroyed. We then go down to the bottom of the page under the heading Destruction of Papers. At your meeting with Lord Jenkin and his 2 visits to the department to inspect the files, we made clear that many key papers from the 1970s and 1980s have been destroyed. These events took place a long time ago. However, our understanding is that during the HIV litigation in the 1990s, many papers from that period were recalled. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were unfortunately destroyed in the early 1990s. In addition, we've established that many other important documents, mostly papers and minutes of the Advisory Committee on Virological Safety of Blood, were destroyed in the 1990s. This shouldn't have happened. During the discovery exercise for the hepatitis C litigation in 2000, it emerged that many files were missing. A low-key internal investigation was undertaken by colleagues in internal audit to establish why files were destroyed. We've managed to obtain the report by internal audit, and you set out the conclusion there, which was that 2 experienced members of staff had left the section, and that the upheavals of the process had meant that there was a delegation of responsibility without proper instruction or an assumption of responsibility without proper authorisation. Either occurrence, likely given the organisational context, is the most probable explanation for the decision to mark the files for destruction and the short destruction dates assigned. The report made recommendations, and then under the heading Advice Recommendation, we advised that you declined to meet with Lord Jenkin. He was informed from the outset that papers from the 1970s and 1980s were missing, and the draft letter attached explains in detail our understanding about why papers were destroyed. Just before we look at the draft letter, was it your decision to recommend that Lord Crisp decline a meeting with Lord Jenkin?
I couldn't recall. I mean, I can't say for certain. I may have had a view at the time. I wouldn't remember what it was, but it would certainly have been discussed with William before a decision was made.
And do you recall anything of that discussion about why a meeting was going to be declined?
I mean, looking back at the papers and reflecting on it now, there's a couple of reasons I could think of. I mean, at this point, Lord Jenkin had already met with Sir Nigel on one occasion. He'd had an opportunity to come in a couple of times to review the papers, and I think on one of those occasions might have met with William. It's probable they would have discussed the destruction of papers then. And there was nothing further to add. At this point, I'd kind of made further investigations around the destruction of the papers for the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And although I wasn't, when the meeting with Sir Nigel took place, I wasn't aware of the background to that because I hadn't at that point followed up the internal audit report. So I didn't know any of that background, but by this point I did, and we just set it all out in a letter to him. And I suppose that the general view was there was nothing more to add.
I want to then pick up the draft letter that you prepared.
Well, may I just ask a question about what is said at the top of the page there? First question is, was the unit in which had the files, which were then marked wrongly for destruction, was that the blood unit you worked in?
I imagine it would have been. Yeah, I don't know what the team would have been called in the 1990s, but it would have been in some shape or form a blood policy team, I imagine.
And that team you've already described. By the time you were in it, you were rather left high and dry, with no one beneath you and no one immediately above you, and only a grade 6, nothing between you and the grade 6. Now that rather fits with what's described here in the paragraph, the implementation of the functions and manpower review, which resulted in 2 experienced members of staff leaving the relevant section. Is that likely to be the 2 people who were under you initially who left, or not, do you think?
This description was obviously
sometime earlier.
Earlier than when I was in the team.
Yes. So how big, roughly, do you think the team would have been then? Do you have any sense?
I can't say, I'm afraid. I have no idea. I can only speak for the time that I would have been in the team. But I was never ever given a sense of how big or small the team might have been at the time these papers were destroyed.
I mean, you were working incredibly hard, so it's not unreasonable to think there may have been further support earlier, but your sense of the structure of it when you first joined was that there would be, administrative officer?
An executive officer.
And then a higher executive officer, and then a senior executive officer. So four people doing the work which you ultimately were covering yourself in the office, and then above that there would have been a grade?
A grade 7.
A grade 7.
mean, not all teams necessarily had that full complement. Sometimes if you had a grade 7, you might not have a grade 6. Mostly you did. Sometimes if you had a HEO, you might not have had an SEO. So doesn't necessarily follow that every team had every single grade, but we certainly had more resource than we did during the time I was in the blood policy team.
So although you don't know for sure, the likelihood is that there would have been something like 5
I can't
people.
Say. I can't really speculate on what that team would have consisted of or comprised of.
Well,
no idea.
Put it this way: would it have been as many as 10?
No, it's unlikely. I've never come across a particular policy team that big before. No.
Yes. The reason I'm asking is that when we had evidence from Lord Crisp on Monday, he was saying that in his view, within a team which is relatively small, most people tended to know what other people were doing.
I think that, this report talks about somebody of a fairly junior grade. I don't know if I necessarily accept that. I've been an EO myself, I've been an AO, currently an SEO, and I have an EO in the team. I don't think it necessarily follows at an EO level you would necessarily know about everything that's going on in terms of discussions with ministers on a particular grade. At EO level, you're very often not copied in to submissions or correspondence with other bodies about formulation in policy or decisions about funding necessarily. So, it might vary within the department, but certainly in my experience, most EOs would not necessarily be copied in necessarily on decisions around the formulation of policy. They are very junior grades, and they'd be kind of focused on administrative tasks, arranging meetings, that kind of thing.
Yes, thank you very much.
Could we turn then to the draft reply that you prepared? It's page 3 of this document. There's some introduction, and then I want to pick up on the 3rd paragraph. As previously mentioned, it's our understanding that during the HIV litigation in the 1990s, many papers from that period were recalled for the purpose of the litigation. We understand that papers were not adequately archived and were subsequently destroyed in error in the early 1990s. The briefing you wrote in the April we looked at before had said that the papers were unfortunately destroyed. In that earlier briefing, there was no reference to whether that destruction had happened deliberately or in error. Do you have any recollection of why that phrase was added to this letter, that the destruction was in error?
I don't, I'm afraid, no.
Had there been any further investigation or inquiries that allowed that statement to be made that the destruction was in error?
No, I don't recall doing any follow-up on the destruction of papers at this point in time.
So your recollection is that from the April briefing that you'd written without the words in error through to this letter, there hadn't been any further investigations?
I don't recall doing any at the time.
And do you have any recollection of any discussions about whether that destruction had been deliberate or in error?
I don't, I'm afraid.
If we then pick up the next paragraph, officials have also established that a number of files were marked for destruction in the 1990s. That relates to the GEB files, I think, is that right?
It is, yes.
Clearly this shouldn't have happened. When the discovery was made that files had been destroyed, an internal review was undertaken by officials. I understand that a decision, most probably made by an inexperienced member of staff, was responsible for the destruction of a number of files. The decision to mark the files for destruction was not a deliberate attempt to destroy documentation. It's very unfortunate that the staff member at the time was not fully aware of the significance of the files and the possibility of future litigation. No, my understanding of the internal audit report is that it was unable to identify the actual member of staff who decided that the documents should be destroyed and why they'd done so. Is that right?
That's my understanding too.
It might be said then that this letter goes too far in making a positive statement about how the decision had been taken and what the position of the staff member was when they took that decision. Do you have any recollection of how you came to
I don't
put
know,
that paragraph
afraid.
in?
No.
Again, do you recall any discussion or further investigation about who the staff member was and why they'd done what they'd done?
No, we'd never, during my time, kind of investigated that at all.
And again, is it right that this draft reply would have been cleared by William Conan before it went up?
Yes.
Throughout this time frame, you were also dealing with a freedom of information request for the documents that were withheld for public interest immunity reasons.
Can I
Apologies.
just ask a question, please, about the next paragraph? Because this is also part of the draft.
It is.
I'm aware that this explanation, now the explanation is that it wasn't a deliberate attempt to destroy documentation, may disappoint some haemophilia lobby groups. What was it, do you recall, that led to your expecting disappointment with a conclusion that the files had been either destroyed in error or not deliberately destroyed?
And obviously, at this point, there were growing calls. I was dealing with FOI cases, and there were growing calls for documentation to be made available. The fact that we knew of papers being destroyed was going to be an obvious disappointment to people, that we were not able to provide documents that they were seeking.
Right, so the explanation that may disappoint is that documents have gone missing.
I think so, yes.
Thank you.
So then picking up the freedom of information request you were dealing with in relation to the public interest immunity documents from the HIV litigation. Could we turn to WITN 4912013, please? And if we particularly pick up on the second page. Can you explain to us what this is? From your statement, you dealt with the requesting of files.
I can't, I'm afraid. No, it looks like it's in connection to file requests, but there's no kind of particular identifier on this to help me. So I don't know.
We heard from Anita James that LIE files were litigation files.
Okay.
In terms of this document, can you explain to us how you obtained documents, perhaps from storage or from a different office? What was the process?
I mean, there was a fairly standard process. We would, to obtain any registered file, we'd email DRO Nelson. So there were a couple of people I knew within the team, and often I email them and request a particular file. I'd give them the full reference number, the name, and they'd kind of respond to say whether or not they'd had the files, whether they'd been sent to me.
And do you recall something like this being a log of those files?
Yeah, I can't say that LIE files seem familiar to me, but certainly these are registered files that we would have. The kind of like prefix indicate that.
If we turn then to your background note on the issues relating to the public interest immunity documents, WITN 4912017, please. And if we turn it to page 3. We see that you've set out under the heading Disclosure of Documents the following. During the HIV litigation, the DH made available a very large number of documents for inspection by the plaintiff's lawyers. Other documents that were wanted by the plaintiff's lawyers were withheld. These papers related to the inner workings of government and were subject to a public interest immunity claim by the department. Initially, the High Court ruled against disclosure of the majority of the documents. However, on appeal on the 20th of September 1990, the Court of Appeal judge ruled that certain documents should be disclosed. There is a paper on file dated the 10th of October 1990, which says that the judge is now inspecting the documents to see which meet the criteria for disclosure. We would need to conduct a further search of the files to establish the outcome of the inspection of these documents. However, a further search would take us to the 3.5 days limit that we have. At the same time, DH were considering proposals for settlement, and a settlement was reached. And then paragraph 6 notes that Mr. Y was requesting copies of the documents which DH had claimed public interest immunity applied to. Then paragraph 7, we have 2 cabinets of papers, about 60 folders, which we understand were sent to our solicitors at the time of the litigation. However, it's not clear which of these papers, if any, would have been made available to the plaintiff's lawyers during discovery. Then over the page. We have also looked at a number of registered files to locate the papers. We found a minute dated the 6th of September 1990, which refers to documents identified under the PII claim and which were sent to Sol. There is also a list of documents marked PII Claim Category 2, Volume 17. In addition, we've consulted with Sol Division. However, we've been unable to establish what happened to these documents. It's also our understanding, having spoken to the previous head of the blood team, that an earlier search for some papers about self-sufficiency into blood products from the 70s and early 80s could not be found. One explanation for this is that papers marked for public interest immunity during the discovery process on the HIV litigation have been destroyed in error at some time in the mid-90s. That was your background note. And if we go back to page 1, we have an email that you sent to Ronald Powell sending him the background note and saying this. I've had a search for the documents requested and have put together a background note on the events that took place. I'd be very grateful for your advice on some of the DNs. It would also be helpful to have a steer on how we should respond. I'm sorry to trouble you, particularly as this relates to events that took place over 14 years ago. Now, Ronald Powell was in the solicitors division, is that right?
Was, yes.
And he had previously been involved in the litigation?
He had been, yes.
You then received a reply to your request, WITN 4912018. And it came from Mike Patrick. If we go over the page to page 3, we see that Ron Powell had passed the query on to him, and pick up at paragraph 3. Sorry, we should probably pick it up in paragraph 2. Under section 11A of the Freedom of Information Act 2000, there's a duty on the Department of Health to confirm or deny whether it holds the information. It's clear from paras 2, 3, 7, 8, 9 and 10 that there is uncertainty about which documents the inquirer has requested, what these documents were and whether these documents exist. DH cannot, of course, disclose something that no longer exists. Given that the litigation happened nearly 15 years ago and appears to have been settled, it wouldn't be unreasonable for the Department of Health to have destroyed those documents. Under the Limitation Act 1980, there is a requirement to keep documents for 6 years. This is because at the end of 6 years, no court proceedings may be brought. The law recognises that there must be finality to decisions. Given the lapse of time and the settlement, it appears likely from what you say that the documents no longer exist. You may therefore write back and say to the inquirer who's made the request that the department believes that the documents requested no longer exist and cite the reasoning in this paragraph as justification. When you received that advice from Sol, did it give rise to any concerns for you?
Again, I can't recall, but reading the papers, I think some of the issues have got really muddled up in my own mind. So Anita James had previously given me a reason for the destruction of the papers, and then Mike's given me something slightly different. At the same time, I think in my background note, I might have been conflating two issues. So I was probably just doing too much at the time. But reading the papers now, it does feel, some of these emails to me feel very muddled, and I might have been getting mixed up in how I was conveying particular issues. So I don't know if I can add any more, but it does feel quite confusing reading back on some of these papers now, and I might have muddled some of the issues up, I think.
The reply that was then sent to Mr. Y, who had made the Freedom of Information request, simply said, we do not, following an extensive search of our records, we do not appear to have retained the documentation. Given that the litigation was settled nearly 15 years ago, it would appear that the documents have been destroyed. Do you know whether the 60 folders of documents were ever assessed as to whether they had, could and should be provided?
I expect I would have looked at them at the time. I think that's the bit that troubles me the most reading these documents now. I must have made a judgment of some kind that they were not relevant, which is why I then further went back to solicitors at the time to find out more information. But I just can't recall, these events happened so far back. But yeah, it does trouble me slightly that what were my thoughts at the time that I found those documents, knowing that I knew papers had been destroyed. I can't say, I'm afraid, because it was just such a long time ago, but it does trouble me a bit reading back.
What understanding did you have of whether a document would fall within public interest immunity or not? Was that something you were familiar with?
No, definitely not. No.
So can I just make sure that we've got the process right. You found 60
I
files.
did, yes.
You weren't confident on public interest immunity.
No. I think there's reference somewhere, though, to me finding a file, and I think possibly from Justice Burton or something listing documents. So, but I wouldn't completely in my mind be clear about what these documents were, but I think there may well have been a list with the documents there that I may have uncovered.
But your understanding of public interest immunity was relatively limited.
Of course, yeah.
And so would you have been able to assess, as at 2005, whether public interest immunity was still of concern?
I don't think so, no.
Did you go back to Sol at all to have a further discussion about this and whether it was right to say to Mr. Y, the documents have been destroyed, when there were 60 files in a cabinet?
Yeah, that's what troubles me the most. I don't know if what I'd seen on the file I might have had in my mind that they were not relevant to the particular FOI case. That's the only explanation I can offer. I don't think it was in any way to try and conceal the fact that there were documents there. I think it was probably just me not really possibly sufficiently understanding what was in those files.
Because if we just go back to your briefing note, WITN 49120017, page 3, please. You've set out at paragraph 7 that there were the 60 folders, but it's not clear which of these papers, if any, would have been made available. So would it be fair that you weren't sure whether they had or hadn't?
I think so, yeah.
And you referred a moment ago to the question if there was a list. It's in paragraph 8 of your briefing note. You'd set it out for the solicitor over the page. That you had found a minute referring to the documents, but you hadn't been able to establish what had happened to those documents.
That's correct.
You've said you're troubled by the reply to Mr. Y.
No, I've been reflecting on these at the weekend, and I can't offer an explanation. I wish now, I don't know, I'm afraid.
During this time, you were requesting a number of files.
I was, yeah. I mean, I think that's probably a point worth mentioning, as well as dealing with this. There would have, at the beginning of my session, I kind of outlined all the other work I was involved in at the time. So, maybe, I don't know, I would have just had so many other competing priorities I would have been dealing with. It might be that I didn't give this my full attention at the time, or not sufficient with hindsight. I just can't tell, I'm afraid. Yeah.
In terms of the documents you were requesting, you've set them out in your statement. Could we turn, just before we take a break, WITN 49120001 is the statement. And could we turn to paragraph 60 on page 22? We can see at the bottom of the page you've set out the bullet points of some of the searches that you were making, just by way of examples. Specific request for a file on the Central Committee for the National Blood Transfusion. Then turn over the page and was told that had been destroyed. You then asked whether it was possible to carry out a search using keywords, and you were in contact with the Iron Mountain storage team. There was an email from Mr. Proctor dealing with further requests and seeking spreadsheets of the files, and then trying to narrow those down. And then we can go down the page a little bit further. There was contact with a departmental records officer trying to find lists of files, contacts with the National Archive, and an access work order as well that you had tried to obtain records from. Two short questions that arise. Did you give any consideration to requesting documents from the Scottish Executive or anyone like that?
I don't recall doing that, no.
Why was that?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, they were devolved administrations and they were very separate to the department, although we did work with them and consult with them on particular issues. They were quite separate to the Department of Health, and it's just that it never occurred to us at the time, I think.
And given the number of requests that were being made in 2005, was any consideration proactively given to which files could be provided to people rather than responding reactively?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Yeah, in 2005 you were getting lots and lots of requests.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was there ever a conversation or a discussion to say, we're getting lots of requests, instead of responding reactively to all these requests, could we do something proactive to put documents into the public domain?
Not at that point, although I know somewhere in the bundle of papers there's reference to me contacting Steve Wells to see if we could.
Yes.
I can't remember now what I was actually asking him, but I was trying to be proactive rather than reactive. Yes. But I can't remember my exact words, but it's definitely there in the bundle of papers.
That we'll come to that later this morning, but at this point in time
no,
you don't
I
recall
don't think
anything.
so, no.
So I note the time, and I wonder if now's a good time to take a break.
Yes, we'll take a break then until 11:45. Now, this is the first break in your evidence. You're giving evidence under oath. What the rules are that you must not discuss the evidence you have given, or for that matter, anything which you think you may yet be asked about with anyone, whoever that anyone is, but you're free to talk about anything else you like. 11:45.